Troy TrojanVision One-on-One. Today's featured guest, Fulbright Scholar and Troy Professor, Dr. Priya Menon. And your host, Dr. Hal Fulmer.
Hello and welcome to this edition of One-on-One. I'm Dr. Hal Fulmer and it's good to have you with us. My guest today is Dr. Priya Menon, professor in our Department of English and a most recent recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Award. It's good to have you with us, Priya.
Thank you, Dr. Fulmer.
I tell you, it must be exciting to think that from here on out, when you send out your resume or someone looks at it, it has Dr. Priya Menon, Fulbright recipient. That is among the most prestigious awards that a faculty member can ever hope to win. Tell us a little bit about how it feels to have won the Fulbright, and then we'll talk about the Fulbright itself. How did it feel when you got notified that in fact you were a Fulbright winner?
It was overwhelming because I wasn't really expecting it. I had put in a lot of effort in preparing the preparing the application and sending it across. And one of the things that the Fulbright Commission does is that it keeps you posted on each stage of review. So I got a note sometime in December, I think, saying that I have crossed the first initial review of my application. And then I had my fingers crossed, and then when the final announcement came, I felt incredibly honored and wonderful. Yeah, so it's exciting. It's exciting to be a part of the Fulbright team.
Right, and for people who might not know, the Fulbright is really an award that was established to promote the highest levels of scholarship and research and teaching in an international context.
Correct. So there are different wings to the Fulbright program. They award scholarships to students to go abroad and teach primarily English. Then there is another wing where if you are primarily a researcher, you can tap into the funds of Fulbright to go to a different country and conduct your research. There is another one which I had applied for where you can do your teaching as well as your research. My primary focus would be research, but I'm also looking into conducting some workshops and providing help in preparing curricula for the local faculty in the area that I'm interested in. So they do really have a wide variety of scholarships that scholars and students alike can tap into.
And as I think everybody would imagine, highly competitive. It's certainly not a case of anybody who would like to be one gets one. You really earn the right to even be considered and earn your right as you go through. I remember early on in my time as a college student, understanding or having someone mention that a professor had had a Fulbright. And there was almost an exoticness about it. You know, he had done his in Greece. And so there was this sense of, wow, that just sounds incredible. So let's talk a little bit now. Your Fulbright is going to take you really back home, right? Back to India. So let's talk a little bit about what you're going to do and where you're going to go. I know you don't have the specifics on the exact institution, but you know the general location where you're headed. So let's talk a little about that.
Yes, my Fulbright experience is going to focus on expatriate workers from India to the Middle Eastern countries, especially the Gulf Corporation countries. So you have the Gulf states or the Arabian states that have a large number of labor force from Southeast Asian countries, primarily from countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, etc. So I am looking at how, or there is a little bit of evidence right now that literature is representing the everyday lifestyles of these people who leave their homes and go abroad to these places primarily for monetary purposes and bring revenue back home. How are their experiences related back to the community that they left behind, as well as is there any sort of access to this sort of an experience to the people and the community that they spend most of their working lives in. So I'm investigating that process. It's a very new and novel sort of an area. Scholarship has just started, progressing in this area. So I'm excited about it.
And these workers who come out of those locations in the South Asia and particularly India area are principally women or women and men? Is it both the groups of people?
There are both, but mainly men. And there has been the immigration or the expatriation to these countries began in late 1960s and early 70s after the so-called Gulf boom, the oil boom. So they needed a lot of workers from different parts of the world to carry on business as usual. So what happened is that workers from these countries, mainly men, go there as physical laborers. Later on, they needed additional workforce and manpower to keep accounts and engineering tasks and maybe white-collar jobs. So you have a wave of workers from different categories, classes, and gender moving to these areas. When you look at a country like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, even I looked up the statistics like last week, and only 13% of the population in that country are natives. The rest of the 87% of people are from the rest of the world. So having this sort of it's an interesting dynamics to look at with this small native population and a large expatriate group who support and feed this population without the rights that one would expect them to have.
And in a current time frame where there's a lot of discussion about people who might be in a country illegally, these are people who in fact were welcomed in, right? I mean, they're a labor force, so they're not in the country in some illegal fashion, but still they are not natives, they're not citizens, they are workers that have come across the Gulf, so to speak, and are now there.
In fact, there has been reports over the last 10 years about these workers' rights, whether they have any rights at all. Very often, these, especially the blue-collared workers, are put into what I would call a ghetto, where they have very poor living conditions. They are hardly paid their wages. They do not have freedom. In some countries they do, but in one of the largest Gulf states, you do not have freedom to practice your own religion, and really no rights of your own. If there is to be an injury of some sort, you are just left on your own. And there have been several cases of trauma of such nature. Most peculiarly, there is this system called the kafala system, where as soon as an expatriate comes in, the sponsor, typically a native person, confiscates the passport of these laborers. And so they have lost all identity, because that's the only form of identity that they have. They've lost any mobility because they lack mobility because they don't have their identification papers. So you become a prisoner in that sense of the term. But I want to also provide this caveat that not all workers in that part of the world go through this sort of a scenario, but a majority, a large number of people go through this. And nothing is said really about this. You have in media, you have instances of this product, so say Dubai, the largest building, the Burj Khalifa in the world. But so you have the product, but who is the maker? How is this made? What are some of the ramifications and consequences of that making process? All that is obliterated in this process, in this conversation of this newfound paradise in the middle of nowhere, really a desert, that is blooming and thriving.
So if you were a historian, your focus would be in one way. If you were a political scientist, it'd be another. You're a person whose expertise is in literature. So how are you going to use your training and understanding of the analysis of text and of literature to look at this very current, contemporary, geopolitical environment and what's happening there? How does literature play into that?
That's a great question, because there isn't any documentation because of the lack of voice and power that these people have. There isn't any documentation on their experiences. The only way for, because in those countries there's a limited amount of freedom in terms of press and free speech, but literature is the only way out, because by virtue of it being fictitious, quote unquote, there is a way for people living there to write about their experiences and their everyday lived realities, and it comes out in the form of literature. So in many ways, it helps them. It protects them from speaking out, yet it is a subversive way of speaking against what is keeping them down.
And I would assume that in this particular case, it's a new set of pieces of literature to study that emerging, but over a long period of having literature as an entity, if you will. There have been other examples around the world over time where literature played that same role, that it allowed, through the guise of fiction, to tell a story that was predominantly true without having to tell it in a way that got an author or a group of people in trouble, right?
That's right. I mean, when you look at fiction in the United States, you have immigrant fiction. In fact, my master's thesis was on this. You have immigrant fiction in the United States of different categories of people, and in many ways that did help communicate deeply and broadly the experiences of these people to those who are curious about them and want to learn more about their experiences. So it is indeed, as you rightly say, you can sort of embed it in a larger global experience. Yes.
So to get to the point where the Fulbright people are recognizing the work that you've done, and clearly have an interest, at least corporately, in this analysis that you want to do, you engaged in a long period of time of other related kinds of research. It's not a case of sign the grant application and hope for the best, right? So your own research now over a period of years has really focused on this idea of how stories are told, often how the people who are displaced or who are expats or who are immigrants.
Yes.
That's really been the area that you've looked at, right?
Yes. For my master's thesis, which I did in Troy, I looked at the immigrant experience of the Indian population within the United States, primarily through the lens of now late Bharati Mukherjee, a very famous writer, a professor at Berkeley, and I looked at the oeuvre of her writing and how one could classify it into the trajectory a typical immigrant would take in realizing his or her dream. But for my PhD dissertation, what I had done is I had looked at internal immigration within India. So there is a lot of, it's a very compelling story of people who cross borders within states as well. India being so diverse, there isn't a sort of a homogenized environment that they go to while this movement happens. So I looked at movement within different states in India related to gender, class, and politics of that nature. So yes.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this because I think for a lot of people, and in a well-meaning way, but for a lot of people, we tend to view the rest of the world very homogenized. So when we think of India, we just think of India, like we would China, like we would Russia, these very broad, somewhat not quite defined political states. But in India, since that's the basis of your research and that's your home, that's not true. I mean, as you and I have discussed, as you move from regions of India to regions of India, there are in some cases, very stark differences, dramatic differences.
Absolutely. In fact, even within a state, there is so much diversity and difference that to bring all this together into this one geopolitical unit as India itself is difficult. So in whatever angle you're looking at, there is so much difference and heterogeneity within communities, cultures, and you and I talked about this, I think, yesterday or day before yesterday, in terms of dressing, food habits of people. It's so different and so wonderfully beautiful that it merits, investigation. And the area of post-colonial studies, a lot of scholars have indeed used their time and talent in order to investigate this. And I, whenever I teach a course in global Anglophone literature here or world literature, I bring in my own stories to my classroom, and my students, I think, enjoy it from the responses that I get.
Right, and we understand that somewhat in this country regionally, because if you're in the deep south, there are those places that as you move through the region and beyond, you eventually get to where you can't find grits on the menu, right? When you pass the grits line, you know that you passed out of the region known as the South, right? And that's also true for the sweet tea line, which is, having had the experience of trying to order that in Boston one time, and that person looked at me and said, "You're not from around here," and I said, "No, I'm not from around here." And so
you gave in too quickly.
I did, and she goes, "I bet." This was her response when I told her I was from. At that time, I was living in Mississippi and teaching at Mississippi State. She goes, "I bet you people," which is always a defining characteristic. "I bet you people drink iced tea year round." I go, "Yeah, we do. We drink it year round, and we drink it sweet, and we have it with our grits." This piece that you mentioned, though, about yourself, coming out of India, coming out of Kerala to the south.
That's right.
Coming here, now writing about a group of people who have had the experience of relocating. Now we're going back. The Fulbright is going to take you home again, contrary to whatever those people are who say you can't go home again, right? You're going home. How is that leaving and coming back? How is that going to inform your research and your understanding and your helping of others develop their curriculum? What does that do for you?
Home is a problematic concept, right? As you mentioned, right now, home is Troy, Alabama for me. I have my family here, and I'm very comfortable. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. This is home for me. And when I go back, I'm very sure that my idea of what home was when I was a child there is going to be very different. During my vacations to visit my mother, I've noticed incredible changes in the small village or city that I grew up in. There's a McDonald's, Domino's.
They may have grits. I mean, this could be just around the corner.
They may just have grits
there. They may have grits. It may be a whole new world.
I need to look into that.
That's right. Well, but you're right about that. I think about when you go back to visit what would be an ancestral home, not ancestry in the deepest sense of time. It always seems that the tree that was so large in the front yard isn't quite so large now. The house that looks so big doesn't look quite so big. So I understand that. But in a cultural sense, you have come out of India, come to America, embraced all of what it means to be here in Troy, and now have an opportunity to go back and have conversations with people who have some deeper level of cultural tie because of the India connection. How is that going to play out for you as you think about that?
Right now, with digital technology, I speak to my uncles and my cousins mostly every week over Skype. I participate in their birthday celebrations via internet, and that disconnect that perhaps an older generation may have had has lessened. But taking this back into my Fulbright experience, I would say that when I read stories about immigration and expatriation earlier on in my life, I did think about it. There was this sort of an intensification and a relationship that I formed with those characters that had moved places because of their need. So I understood that. But now, getting deeper into research, I recognize that the empathy that the author wants me to have had when reading those characters is a universal phenomenon. Whether it is my personal story or if it's someone else reading it, they would all have a similar sort of a reaction to that. So my personal ethnic history would only be a small piece, relevant albeit, but a small piece in that puzzle that I find fascinating. Why do people leave home? How does it inform their own well-being or otherwise, and how do they relate to what are called natives, especially when when boundaries and borders are closing in. Mm-hmm. So it's really fascinating.
And I understand that too. I mean, Marshall McLuhan in the 60s couldn't quite see around the curve to understand the internet and Skype and all that. He understood it. He understood television as the primary force. I think if McLuhan had lived, he'd have understood that the internet and the web and the digitalization was. But when he talked about the global village, that's really what you're talking about.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
The ability to connect across those barriers, particularly of space. The other thing is very interesting, and I think you and I previously talked about Richard Weaver, who was a noted writer, particularly in the 1960s. And Weaver was multi-generation North Carolinian. He was trained at Vanderbilt and LSU. But Weaver went to the University of Chicago, in part because he said he had to get outside of the South to write about the South. It was kind of an interesting thing for him that he needed that perspective of distance to be able to talk about his very much his cultural home, and so. And
you're right, and I think that makes a big difference to go back and look at it from a distance. You see things that you would not have if you were immersed in that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, the perspective.
That's right.
Well, let's talk for a minute or two as well. The Fulbright experience going, and yours is going to be an extended stay. I think in some capacity up to 6 months in this process. Yes. So you're interacting with other people, you're continuing your research. Then you come back to the classroom at Troy University. What does it mean as you look ahead to come back as a professor and scholar here, having had that kind of experience? What does it do for you in the classroom at Troy, and particularly as you interact with our students?
What I hope to do, and I have done parts of this in a course that I had taught the last semester. I had taught a course called Global Anglophone Literature, and I had used a particular text that I'm interested in terms of my Fulbright, called Goat Days by a writer called Priya Menon, coming out of Kerala, talking about this expatriation in the Middle East. And I brought it here to Troy to my students here, who the entire class was not really aware as to where the Middle East is and the dynamics there. But after the entire semester, when I asked them for some sort of feedback, the book and the discussion that they enjoyed most was Benjamin's Go Day. So I find it fascinating that here we are in Troy, Alabama. Our students are getting a slice of what it means to be an expatriate in the Gulf Corporation countries, and they become aware of what is happening there. So that I had done already, but post Fulbright, it'll be interesting to see how I can thread through various, even teaching nuances that I may have forgotten because I was a student back in India, to bring that back into our community as well. So I hope to bring, some amount of teaching, research, and even cultural tying in to my classrooms and to our community.
And I think, really the Fulbright in its purest form, that's what it hopes to do, is not only to send out the teacher scholar, but to bring back the teacher scholar or the student. We think about Troy as an international university, and Alabama's international university, the large population of international students that are on our Troy campus, and our focus in that global context of understanding the rest of the world. This is certainly a part of that. Let's spend a minute or two as well, because this isn't just a focus of the issues of this group who've come across the Gulf and are working in say the Emirates and the creation of those texts. It's really a part of a larger set of issues too. The notion of what defines citizenry, the notion of empowerment as an individual, and maybe ultimately the notion of what does it mean to relocate. Immigration has so many different subtle and sometimes not so subtle connections, but to relocate. Really your work is a part of what would be ultimately a much larger set of issues, really important right now.
Now, citizenship definitely is an issue here. People who go to labor in the GCC countries are not offered citizenship right away. I think there is a little, a small sliver that is assigned to people who make, a certain sort of income to apply for citizenship, but I have yet to come across, anyone who has had citizenship in that country, and it is so wrapped up in mystery. Really, nobody knows. So, in terms of particularly immigration and citizenship in that part of the world, that is an issue that writers need to constantly voice through their literary text, because there is no other medium for it to come out rather than literature. So I'm hoping that this need for participation on both sides. So Kerala, the state that I come from, has the largest group of expatriate labor force to GCC countries, around 2.5 million people from Kerala.
Yeah, that's staggering.
It's
when we think about the numbers, of course, that's in a country of India that has a billion or more.
More people, and Kerala is there is even in economics, people are very curious about that state. Within the broader perspective of India, you have the highest literacy, 100% literacy in that state. You have, in terms of Human Development Index, it is on par with some of the first world countries. In fact, very close to the United States, with half of its GDP. So it is sort of a paradox in the larger picture. So with these many people from Kerala immigrating to the Gulf Cooperation countries and sending back revenue to Kerala, what is the government or what is the political, social, cultural establishments back in these states doing in order to support their stay there and relocation when they come back? They are not allowed to vote, because typically not allowed to vote. There is no opportunity for them to vote because they're away, and issues of that nature really need to be voiced and brought under some sort of scrutiny. And I think literature is the best medium under the given circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this study particularly interesting, is that it allows for a certain amount of legs over time. You're going to study in this particular fashion, this particular issue, but clearly it unspools. There are more issues to talk about. There's a whole set of issues that deal with what's the impact of the expats on the countries in which they're working, not just from a physical labor force, but from a cultural force as well.
Right. And how does daily practices like food, the number of Indian restaurants, for example. This is in England, if you go, their national food is the Indian curry, right? It's become a part of their lifestyle. Sure. But I'm yet to see that in the Gulf Cooperation countries. My father lived there. I've spent a lot of time there. I hope it will change.
Yeah, I do too, and I look forward to having you back on when you get back from your Fulbright. And we thank you for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us again next time.
Thank you.